of international contexts, such as Rwanda and Indonesia, and her most recent publication, Poetic Inquiry in Rwanda, Engaging with the Lives of Others, focuses on arts-based inquiry, international collaboration, and the therapeutic uses of writing in response to trauma. So now, without further ado, Dr. Laura Apol.
I'm going to trust that this is all working exactly the way it's supposed to. Thank you, Stella, even though I can't look back at you. And thank you, John. And thank you to the faces here who have come in person and the people who are attending online. It's an odd feeling to have the online people behind me, but I'm sure I'll get used to it. So I'm so thrilled to be here and grateful for this invitation. What a lovely program you have, and what an opportunity to think with you about tonight the ways that poetry serves as a healing art. And when I'm talking about poetry, I understand that we don't have flocks of people here who are thinking about poetry because poetry doesn't always bring in the masses. But I'm going to say that tonight when I'm talking about poetry, I'm talking about writing in general, poetry in particular, but the things I'm going to talk about are really true of writing. And for me as a poet, poetry is the way I use writing. So when I say poetry, if you'd rather substitute a word that's not poetry, that's just fine with me. So poetry as a healing art. It might seem that poetry as a healing art would be about resolution, about peace, about acceptance, but the aspect of poetry as a healing art that I wish to talk about is a different aspect. Poetry does, of course, help us articulate resolution and peace and acceptance. Those spaces of healing we find comforting and familiar. But poetry is also a journey toward those places, and that journey, conflicted, confused, resistant, filled with doubt, is healing as well. As readers, we turn to the poems of others who find words for our fears, our loss, our deepest longings. As writers, we map an inner landscape, follow words that lead us into deeper understandings or allow us to question, to grieve, to rage, to resist, and sometimes in the process to begin to heal. Well, there are many examples of times when poetry was healing for me as a reader, poems that spoke to me in ways that made me feel understood, that gave voice to my deepest longings or fear or pain. For the next few minutes, I'd like to use as examples times in my life when poetry was especially healing for me as a writer. I've chosen examples of specific moments where I choose with intention to write in response to challenge, difficulty, or trauma. And I'm just going to say right now that the dog is learning to roll over, and she caught me today. So when I touch my lip, it's not anything except that I'm still feeling how enthusiastic she was and how uncomfortable that feels. So as we're thinking about poetry and writing and healing, the first time in my life that I want to talk about poetry and healing is that poetry was a way of saying the unsaid. I lived in Oklahoma in 1995 when the Murrah building bombing took place. I was teaching poetry at the university, running poetry workshops, doing readings, and in the weeks that followed the bombing, I watched the outpouring of emotion that took place around me. Oddly, much of this took the form of poetry. People put poems, their own and others, in the fence around the site. They put poems in the memory book in the nearby chapel. Because I was identifiable as a poet, strangers began to bring poems to me, poems they had written after the bombing. I was fairly sure most of those people hadn't read much poetry, and I was certain most of them had never before written a poem. Yet there they were, turning to poems as a way to say and to have said for them things they could not express any other way. I wrote my own poem at the time. I belonged to a church that was significantly impacted by the bombing, and the pastor asked me to write a poem that would talk about God's ongoing presence and care through this horrific event. I agreed, but found I simply was unable to write the poem she requested. I had to write my own poem of anger and confusion, my own rage against the divine. It was an honest poem, and for me, the healing came from my willingness to allow the poem to say in truth what it needed to say. You'll hear in the poem the moment when you'll hear in this poem, the moment when the poem I intended to write turns into the healing poem I ultimately wrote. The poem is called After the Bomb, April 20th, 1995, Oklahoma City. Beneath my clothesline, 2 sparrows, blue-veined, sparse, feather-fuzzed, blown, I suppose, from the tree in last night's storm, the storm that kept the children awake as thunder pounded the windows, explosions of sound like this Thursday, and I can't say it. I can only hang laundry because I am numb, because there is comfort in doing what I do and what I know in the face of all I can't do and will never understand. And so, with arms raised, I hang laundry. Daughter's pajamas, son's favorite shirt. The act is serene, but my mind is a sky-piercing no. No to flames and a silence like thunder. No to camera crews, cranes, and yellow police tape. No to concrete slabs, medic tents, flags at half-mast. No to 1,000 stitches, broken glass, broken bones, broken babies. No to waiting body bags. Grief, stories too painful to tell. No to the sun still rising, the grass still growing, holly hedge, irises, careless blue sky. No to mockingbirds, hummingbirds, cardinal songs. No to finches and gray morning doves. And no to the sparrows, the yellow-beaked sparrows. No to the elm tree they fell from, no to God's eye that was sleeping, and no to the almighty fingers they, hollow-boned, weightless, slipped through. So for me, putting side by side the poem I was sort of asked to write and the poem that I had to write, the words that were unsayable that I had to say, was sort of the first time in my consciousness that writing and poetry played that kind of a role toward healing, toward saying what I couldn't actually say in any other way. Then the second time in my life comes in what I'm calling exploring the unconscious, the way that poetry works toward healing or writing works toward healing, helps us explore the unconscious. And so a few years after this poem, I had a different sort of experience with writing and healing. I was approaching my 40th birthday, and as the date neared, I became increasingly depressed. I didn't mind turning 40. Far from it. My life was filled with positive things. I'd just gotten tenure. My children were loving, creative, and healthy. I was writing and publishing, leading workshops, running marathons, and learning home repair. But I was sad. I had always grown inexplicably despondent as my birthday neared. And no amount of cheer, parties, phone calls, gifts, travel, ever took that sadness away. For me, birthdays always began and ended in tears. At some time in my late childhood, I learned by accident that I'd been a twin, but that the other baby, a girl, was born dead. According to this story, the fetus that was delivered had died early in the pregnancy. Consequently, my parents had never expected twins, and in their telling, had experienced no loss or disappointment. As they put it, we expected one baby and we got one baby. The twin had not been named or buried, had not been, but for an accidental hearing on my part, a story that would remain forever untold. And so as I neared 40, I decided it was time to face this birthday dread I felt year after year. Even if my parents claimed not to have experienced loss, I wanted to explore the possibility that pre-birth and in birth, I had lost something that could never be replaced. I set aside the day, my birthday, to write my way towards some understanding of this loss. I wanted to get to know my sister, to make her real, and to explore and honor her impact on my life. The writing became a poem, Twin Sister Stillborn. In this poem, you'll hear how communicating through writing with a sister I lost before birth allowed for intimacy, connection, acknowledgement, and grief. In writing the poem and making my loss real, I began the journey towards self-understanding and healing. Twin Sister Stillborn. This has a head note that has the word liana, which is French, and it means to bind. That means, and the translation is any luxuriantly growing vine that roots in the ground and climbs as around a tree trunk. Twin sister stillborn, I am the one who knew you, the only one who will ever know. I felt the push of your new heart, the swim of your limbs, the turn of yourself as you turned toward me. We were wild fish, smooth, wet dancers side by side, entwined. Our cells divided, then ourselves divided, and in a liquid mirror, we were a double face with identical sightless eyes, same nubby fingers, same zippered spines. If they had known we were us, had seen through the stretched wall into the cave of our shared life, they would have seen two shadows bobbing and would have sung lullabies twice. They would have found a name that could divide not into half, but evenly into itself. And then they would have seen one shadow quiet, one wild fish fail, forever imprinting loss in the growing bones of the other. By the time I rushed us into the world, one name was all we needed, a name for me. 40 years later, I choose our birth, death, day to name you now. Liana, tenacious vine holding me. I have called your unnamed name across the years, never knowing you were the absence I was trying to fill. The end of a sentence I didn't know how to begin. I am echo to your silence. You are the loss I took all these years to find. So fast forward a little bit, and writing and poetry play a different role in my life. I'm calling this understanding, activism, and change. So more than a decade later, I embarked on a project that would teach me a different relationship between poetry and healing. In 2006, I went to Rwanda to create with Rwandan and US colleagues a writing workshop to use with survivors of the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi. Together, we created a format that would allow survivors to compose their testimonies in ways that emphasize the therapeutic aspects of writing. At the same time, I wrote poems of my own based on the experiences I was having in Rwanda, learning about the long and ongoing history of colonial trauma that played out in the genocide and my own country's lack of interest or intervention. So while I was running a writing workshop for others, I was writing poetry of my own to try to make sense of what I was learning and experiencing, and to communicate my own feelings of responsibility as a witness. Those poems eventually were published in the collection entitled Requiem Rwanda. The healing I experienced through this writing was not only through personal expression. I had a sense that my poems had work to do in the world. I wanted them to speak to others and to begin to bring about change. The following poem was my response to a particularly troubling story about the role of the Catholic Church in the genocide. It ends with the words of a priest spoken after he has given his congregants their last Eucharist. The tight structure of the poem and the unexpected and horrific turn at the end in the voice of the priest give the poem its power and call forth the speakers, that's mine, and I hope the reader or listener's healing rage. I'm going to read it twice because it's very short, and you'll hear the voice of the priest at the end of the poem. The poem is called Eucharist. Eucharist has always been about betrayal, the Judas kiss before death. Some priests were complicit, they say, offering shelter, then opening doors for the killers to come in. One blessed the bread, then unlocked the gate. I have other Christians. You can have these. Read it a second time. Eucharist has always been about betrayal, the Judas kiss before death. Some priests were complicit, they say, offering shelter, then opening doors for the killers to come in. One blessed the bread, then unlocked the gate. I have other Christians. You can have these. So that's another way that writing served as a means of healing for me in my own lived experience and in the work that I was doing with other people. Another way is that writing and poetry has allowed me to revisit the story. So a few years after I finished the book of Rwanda poems, my mother died, having struggled with multiple sclerosis for decades. Once more, I found myself writing into and through my grief. The following poem focuses on an altercation I had with my mother when I was in high school. I'd intended the poem to be a pushback to the ways guilt was used as motivation by my parents. But as I entered the poem, it became a way to think not only about my mother, but about the extended family I was born into. By reimagining an experience from my own childhood, I reimagined my mother's family of origin as well, an understanding and ultimately a generational healing that took place as I revisited and revised my own and my mother's stories. At the start of the poem, you'll hear my mother's voice as it was. Later in the poem, you'll hear it as I'd liked it to have been, as I imagine it could have been, and ultimately the understanding and healing that is the result of that imagined revision. The poem is called The Gift of Yes. The Gift of Yes. I tell my mother I want to go to the lake water skiing with friends instead of to Sunday service. And this time she does not say, Laura, you know how we feel about this. She does not say, you can make up your own mind, but you know how we feel about this. She does not say, my parents would never have let me go, but you can make up your own mind, and you know how we feel about this. Instead, she says, yes. Have a good time, and here's some money for ice cream. And in that moment, her own father opens the door. Her mother hands me suntan lotion and a hat. Her sister tosses me a towel, and with her gift of yes, my mother climbs in beside me in the back. So you can see how writing that poem leads me to understand something about my mother's own growing up that I hadn't understood when I started out in the poem. The next way that I want to talk about is writing as an outlet for grief. In the past few years, I have done the hardest work in writing I could have imagined. In April 2017, Hannah, my adult daughter, died. For all her life, Hannah had been my muse, her brightness, her spiritedness, her provocations. I didn't know how I could bear her absence, but I also couldn't imagine that I could turn anywhere but to words, to thrash around in these, my deepest questions and struggles, my excruciating sense of loss and pain. For a whole year, I wrote and wrote and wrote. And as words formed on pages, as I went back and moved lines, deepened images, found structures that could hold my brokenness, I found moments of peace. I found language for what was unspeakable. I wrote for a year, everyday poems, poems on weighted anniversaries, all the firsts without her, Mother's Day, Thanksgiving, Christmas, my birthday, her birthday. This poem was written on the 9-month anniversary of her death. 9 months is the duration of a pregnancy, and I was highly aware that I had carried her for 9 months forward into her life, and now I had been carrying her for 9 months after her death. The poem is called Gestation. Gestation. The last time I counted months, I was waiting for her. She, the rhythm beneath my stretched skin, an elbow, a heel, head up, head down, lotus, bridge, down dog, mountain, warrior. The last time I counted months, she was moving toward me, my body readying to push her into the world. Now I am counting months again. Today marks as long for her to pass from sight as it took her to arrive. Gestation reversed, a telescope turned backward on time. She has grown smaller, smaller, until only I know her turns, her slides, her flips and kicks. She is once more the secret I keep at my center, the delicate curve of spine, the translucent eyelids closed. And then finally, something I'm calling writing into acceptance. The kind of healing that writing can lead to is not some sort of finish to sadness. It's not a panacea. It doesn't make pain go and stay away. It's a way to navigate, a means to live into and through. It provides solace of sorts, both in the process and product, word by word, line by line, poem by poem. It allows for acceptance and integration. The poems I wrote in the year that followed Hannah's death became a collection entitled A Fine Yellow Dust. In that year's writing, I had a structure for my grief. I had a container. I had a destination. The destination wasn't that I would feel no more pain or that I would be healed. It was the knowledge that I had come through the first year and had found words to explore and communicate what was from the start both unsayable and impossible to understand. I ended my year of writing in late April 2018, and then I had one more poem to write. This poem stood outside the year and was the only poem in the book that was written to Hannah, the only poem in which I spoke directly to her as the daughter I loved. It was a heartfelt PS to the collection. And while it did not signify healed, it did acknowledge the beginning of healing, the start of my acceptance of great loss, and a reminder of my fierce attachment and abiding love. The poem is called A Pause in the All-Day Rain. A pause in the all-day rain for Hannah Grace. In the quietest reach of late afternoon, the light, without warning, dapples and shifts, finding new leaves in the saucer magnolia we planted for you last week. I watch the green bending here and here. Think perhaps I should have given you the quilt I tossed over my bed. It matches your sofa. Catch myself once more. Friday, I had your name inked into the skin of my inner arm, so I'd be reminded, not of you, but of your absence, would stop reaching for the phone. Now I want to tell you I blistered my hand on the stove. The cat is showing her age. I've set up a pad and blankets near my desk. You should know I'm better with her, more space in the heart perhaps. Good morning, love, I say out loud each day on waking, to whomever is listening. So those are the poems. That's the journey. How then is poetry a means of healing? It's not magic. It's not miraculous, though some days it feels like that to me. But really, it's both the process and the product of writing poetry that has therapeutic value. Very briefly then. The writing process allows us to make meaning through words or to explore what seems not to have meaning. I couldn't write comfort into the poem so quickly after the Oklahoma bombing, but railing against God was meaninglessness I could articulate and share. In their crafting, poems provide distance or perspective. Words stand outside the emotions that propel them forward. They can move and be moved. A writer steps in, steps back to find just the right word, line break, turn of phrase. The poem becomes the thing, a thing in itself. It's a container that holds the experience, the emotion, and it can be looked at and engaged separate from that experience. If we trust the writing process, it leads to discovery. I wanted to understand the sadness surrounding my birthday and to explore what it meant to me for all my life to have and to be a lost twin. In the process of writing, I saw myself connected in joy with the sister who shared the womb with me and allowed myself to grieve her loss and its reverberations through my whole life. Poetry allows us to bear witness to our own pain and hurt, as well as the pain and hurt of others. The Rwanda poems were healing in that their intent was to raise awareness and challenge others to action. Hearing the words of the priest at the end of the Eucharist poem is shocking and horrific and is deliberate in a desire to bring forward questions and perhaps action in a reader or listener. The process of writing can teach us something in the doing. I set out to write about how pissed off I was at my mother for manipulating me into staying home from water skiing. As I wrote, I learned that rewriting the event as I wished it in The Gift of Yes not only freed me, it also freed my mother and her family from the rigid constraints and the guilting that was so oppressive and toxic across generations. When the poem gets it right, the right word, the right cadence, the right image, the right ending, it brings a feeling of resolution that not only settles the poem, it settles the writer, speaker, and the reader, listener as well. The reader experiences the emotion with rather than about the poem or the writer. If I say, I'm devastated by the loss of my daughter, or I'm terrified that she's disappearing, it is not as powerful or memorable as presenting the image of a telescope turned backward on time, and the physical intimacy of presenting a mother carrying a child inside her before birth and again after death. A reader can feel that with the speaker of the poem, and there's healing in that kind of feeling community. Writing can allow for the beginning of healing, the tiniest hints of resolution to be nurtured into words and thoughts and expressions. A pause in an all-day rain is not only a pause in rain. It's a momentary pause in relentless grief, a glimmer, however brief, of acceptance and the integration of loss. Ultimately, poetry, writing and reading, process and product, is healing because it makes something beautiful, art, from confusion, outrage, loss, trauma, and pain. Poet Anne Michaels writes that sometimes language is the rescuer. And poet Jay Perini writes, as a language adequate to our experience, poetry allows us to articulate matters of concern in such a way that they become physical, tangible, and immediate. That's it, I think. Poetry is a language adequate to our experience, however incomprehensible, broken, and raw that experience might be. And that language can provide, can serve as the beginning of the rescue we need. Do we need to do a little dance here? Oh, I'm supposed to be up there.
No.
I
Yeah,
can do
we,
that.
we can do that.
We can?
Yeah,
Okay.
let's just push it towards you there.
We can take it off the box, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Right. Except I'm gonna get a pen. That's what writers do. Right. So from what I understand now is time for a conversation. Is that right? A chance for us to talk a little bit, including the people on who were behind me before, who are there now. Lovely to see you.
All right, well, first off, Dr. Apol, I would like to say that was a lovely presentation. I think everyone here is just equally blown away by your words. So I'd just like to thank you for that. And now I would like to open up the floor for discussion. So if people would like to raise their hand on Zoom or pose a question in the chat, I can field the questions to our speaker. And if someone would like to let me know if there are questions in the room at the People's Church as well.
Do you write simply spontaneously on your feeling, or do you have, writers have times when they write and they closet themselves to write? So how does that work out with the poem?
So the question is whether there's a particular time that I write or whether I just write when I feel like it. So the writer Peter DeVries says, I write when I'm inspired and I see to it that I'm inspired at 9 o'clock every morning. Which I wish that were true. And once I'm retired, maybe it will be true. It's not true at the moment. So for me, I've had the gift of a career that let me have times that I could really devote to writing. So the grants that sent me to Rwanda allowed me to really spend time thinking and writing there. After Hannah died, I had already scheduled a sabbatical, so I had time to write. So I have had a life that has allowed for time to write, but I also find that when some of these moments come up that have really, once a student asked me, how come you always ask us to write such sad things? And I said, well, let's look back at what I've asked you to write. And there was nothing sad in anything I asked them to write. But I think for many of us, when we write from our hearts, it's that edge that we can't quite work out another way. And when I find those edges, I find that I have to give them time and attention.
So I have a question. So how many do you go over and over a poem, or does it just sort of come out pretty much the way you want? Is there a lot of editing involved, or?
So the question is whether there's a lot of editing involved or if the poems just come out the way they come out. And there's a wonderful quote, I can't remember who said it, that poems are never finished, they're just abandoned. And there's another thing that I really believe, which is that the difference, so I think there's the writing that we do that works therapeutically, and then there's the writing that we do that goes out in the world, and sometimes there's overlap. But when I lead workshops, very often what we talk about is that the difference between writing and therapy is that writers revise. And of course, what I have always brought to the process of writing is myself as a poet who lives in the world of poetry. So if I could show you how many versions of poems there are, you would say you should have a different hobby, Laura, like dog training. But no and yes. Very often, the poem begins in something that comes out very quickly, but then there's a lot of shaping that happens that moves it into something that can go out into the world.
We have a couple comments in the chat here. Nell says, I have no questions other than how one finds words to so exquisitely express so much. Thank you. And Susan Patterson stated, I am 80 years old and consider myself well read, but never understood poetry until tonight.
Ah, thank you. Thank you.
Or you mentioned these different episodes in your life that obviously you reflected on through your poetry. And in all different episodes, our daughter is a poet, a published poet, and has dealt with personal challenges and issues through her poetry writing, both poetry and essays. So I have two questions, and they're diametrically not related. The first one is, being a former journalist, I'm a little bit curious because you brought it up that you heard about the loss of your twin sister either through a third party or anecdotally or something that just didn't come right out of the horse's mouth, so to speak. And if it's comfortable, if you're comfortable, how did you learn about that? Because all of us have learned about bits and pieces of our family history sometimes out of left field over here. Gosh, I didn't know that was in my family or whatever. So I'm interested in that. And then do you do, and I'm sure you do, but other expressions of writing in addition to poetry through essay writing or through more narrative? Your poetry is, to me, contemporary, but yet reflective. Have you had the opportunity to explore in other tools of your feelings?
But so the first question is about how so many of us learn family secrets or not necessarily secrets, just stories, sort of inadvertently or by accident.
Yes.
And how does that happen? So I was about 8 years old when I overheard someone who had had twins say to my mom, "Well, Gladys, you had twins." And wow, that was like a lightning bolt, because she said yes. And I thought, why is she saying she had twins? There's me and there's my brother. And so of course I immediately I immediately asked about that and got told that maybe we'd talk about it in the car. And I didn't forget it when we got in the car. And so that's when I was about 8 when I learned that, but it was so dismissed that all I thought really was, oh, I feel so much competition with my brother. Imagine if I also had to be competing with a twin, thank goodness. And that was sort of the most anyone talked about it or that I felt anything about it for many, many, many years. And then a friend, when I was sort of saying, oh, it's my birthday again, and I couldn't explain such sadness about my birthday. And I felt really shallow. Like, how can a person, it was this that I didn't get the right attention, that I didn't get the little crown on my head, you know, our parents give us cakes with candles and now that was over. What was the problem with me? And someone said, you know, when twins are separated at birth, they experience loss and the sense of an other for their whole lives. And why would that start at the moment of birth? Why would the moment of birth be the moment that started? And that sort of started happening. Now, I do have a new poem in which my father tells me the story of my birth. Again, I want to know about it. And instead of him telling me about my birth, he tells me about the car that he was driving. The poem is about, like, that wasn't exactly the story I wanted, but okay, it's a start. And it ends with him saying, so when you were born, people offered their condolences. And that's just, I'm saying that as a window into this family story and how not only was it not told, it was completely dismissed as inconsequential, as not something that would matter, which I think, you know, that's one version of what happens with, you know, those stories. I mean, the other is that, wow, nobody wants to tell the story because it's so consequential. But so that's how that came about. So this is a recording, and so my dad might, okay, he won't listen to it. Never mind. The other question that you had is if I do other kinds of writing. Again, I'll say I have the great good fortune of never having been hired as a poet, but being in an academic position where, of course, I do the kinds of academic writing that I'm asked to do and that I enjoy doing. But I've also been allowed to do this different kind of writing, and it's been sort of, there's been a space created for it. And what I'm really doing a lot of right now is sort of thinking about how poetry works and how poetry can work as research, how it can work as healing, how it can work as activism and change, how it can work as witness. So the ways, and when I'm talking about those things, certainly I'm doing a poetry, but I'm also doing it in more narrative and more, I'll put air quotes around, scholarly kinds of ways.
We have a couple questions in the chat here. The first one comes from Joel. He asks, what poets and poetry do you recommend for rookies to start with?
Oh, I don't like that question, but, and I know I should have a prepared answer, but I do have a little bit of a prepared answer, which is that we have a new poet laureate in the US, and her name is Ada Limon. And she's wonderful. I have loved her for many years, and I couldn't be happier that she's the poet laureate. And part of why I really appreciate her so much is because it feels sometimes like poetry is divided into two camps. And one is the poetry that no one understands and someone has to help you with, and maybe no one can help you with, and really you don't care if they help you with it or not. And then there's the poetry that's super accessible, and it's in greeting cards, and it's poetry that sort of says very straightforwardly what it means. And to my way of thinking, part of what's magic about poetry is the way it comes in from the side, as Emily Dickinson says, tell the truth, but tell it slant. And what I think poetry lets us do is live in those in-between moments and sort of thrash around in them. And if we trust that a poet is going to reward us, we can thrash for a long time and feel really great about what we find. So when we sort of split the world that way, there's not much space for getting excited about poetry, I don't think. But what I love about Ada Limon is that she sort of lives in between there. So there's a great reward. It's accessible poetry, but it's brilliant. And there's lots of space in it. And so if I had to just give you one person to start with, I would say Ada Limon. And then if I had to give you two people, I would say W.S. Merwin is another person who there's great reward for spending time. And you can really feel like there's something to take with you instead of something that makes you feel like you're in 11th grade English again.
Very good. We have another question from Bennett. Bennett asks, in my education, meter and rhyme in poetry were emphasized. Is this still so? And if not, when did this change?
So I think, no, it's not so anymore. Sometimes it happens still, but there's a reason that Robert Frost says that free verse poetry is like playing tennis without a net, because he's sort of at the moment where some people are writing with very structured rhythm and rhyme, and people are breaking away from that. And William Carlos Williams, who's another poet that's really wonderful to look up. He's the person who wrote maybe one of the most famous poems that we know as a US classic poem. He wrote the one about the red wheelbarrow, and so much depends upon the red wheelbarrow glazed with rain beside the white chickens. And so he's an imagist, and he starts us thinking about, although of course he doesn't invent it, but he's sort of where we kind of start paying attention to images as opposed to the form of a poem and the rhythm and the structure of a poem. And once that's happening, sort of rhythm and rhyme step back, and the idea that meaning can be carried through images comes to the fore. And that's what's been happening for the last half century, probably in poetry. But there are certainly people, Diane Seuss just won, I can't remember if it's the Pulitzer or I think it's the Pulitzer, for something called the Frank Sonnets. So she's writing sonnets, and those are poems that have very strong formula. So there are people who are doing really great work in form, but for the most part, that's the aberration, not the way most poetry is happening right now.
I have kind of a double question, and I guess the first thing is, we were talking about poetry as healing. did that writing about your experience with the twin in the room and the current one you're writing, has that, do you feel it was healing? That's the first part of it. And the second is, where could somebody, thinking of a particular person who has a great deal of trauma, a great gift for writing, where would they go to learn how to use poetry to heal, or do you just say, just give it a whirl? That's a couple.
Yeah. So there's sort of a double question here that's about whether in fact writing about the experience with my twin proved to be healing. And I would, so I'll start with that. I would say that if healing means that when I approached my birthday each year, I could say to myself, oh, Liana, there you are. Then that seems like, yes. If it was that I became a party girl on my birthday, probably no. Right?
But it allowed you to
Yeah, and I sort of didn't understand that sadness until I wrote the poem. And then once I wrote the poem, I did understand more about what was happening inside me on that, you know. And then the question is, so where would a person have a chance to do this kind of writing? So there are certainly, John Fox is a person who has put together, and James Pennebaker, they have books that sort of guide people through some of this writing and healing. Gregory Orr is a poet who is brilliant in thinking about this. His story is that when he was a young boy, he went hunting with his father and his brother, and he shot his brother, and his brother died. And he lived with that for years and years and years, because of course his family could not help him understand. They were also grieving. And it wasn't until he started writing, and he says, writing saved my life. You know, he had to write about what that experience had been. And so he's done books. He has a book called The Blessing, which sort of maybe raises the hair on the back of your neck at first when you think about something so horrific being termed a blessing. But he really engages, and there's another one, I can't remember what Poetry of Trauma or something, but he really thinks hard and has exercises for how to enter some of these spaces. And of course, there are workshops and people online who are doing things that one could search for as well.
We have a comment here from Esther. Esther says, poetry has had such a bad rap because our English teachers always told us we must follow rules about rhyme, syntax, or the dreaded iambic pentameter. Thank you for guiding us toward writing poetry outside the lines.
Yeah, it gets a bad rap for writing it that way and for reading it that way too. So yeah, thanks, Esther. That's
That is Gregory Orr, his last name O-R-R.
ORR, Gregory Orr, yeah. And James Pennebaker is the person who does a lot with writing and healing and workbooks.
You know, you were describing something earlier that poetry a half century ago, the approach to it began to change or widen, the scope of it began to widen. And it's almost the same, well, you can go centuries before with painters and how we got into more abstract art and expression of art. And it just took a while maybe for poets to catch up, but I look at poets much like a painter, and particularly from that visioning that you were talking about, imaging. And it seems like the two disciplines can merge together quite often.
Absolutely. And there, there are a lot of people who write from art. And one of the things that I do with my students every year is take them either to the Sabre galleries or to the Broad and have them sort of engage with that aspect, exactly what you're saying. And I should have said Ezra Pound really is the person who changes, who introduces images.
It looks like Judy Ashley has a question here. Oh, would you like to unmute yourself, Judy?
This isn't exactly a question, but it's a comment about some of the things you're talking about. It's interesting that the timing of all this. I have just spent the last 2 days organizing all the papers that I have in my apartment that I have written, that I brought with me to about 2 years ago when I moved into this apartment. I left my daughter's house and I left 7 boxes, book-sized boxes of papers that were, quote, my diaries from the time I was in 5th grade until I'm going to be 80 this summer. So most of the time. And this last, like I said, the last 2 days, I've just been organizing what I consider finished manuscripts to put in some kind of order so that in the future, somebody, if they so want to, they could read, but they're all finished. And they're in date order, goes back to 1980 and up to the very most recent one. And what an incredible experience it was putting this in order. I can't believe that I just found out how much of my life I spent writing. I had to be writing 4 to 6 hours a day. I do not know how I did it. And I just didn't know. And it's marvelous to find out that I always aspired to be a writer. It never dawned on me that I might be one, and one of the things that I have often said, and this is sort of a follow-up to what some of the things you're saying, I have always said, I have never looked at a piece of paper in any of those 7 boxes. I've never gone back and looked at any of it. It's all garbage as far as I'm concerned, but I can't get rid of it. And one of the things that I say, if I can just get it out, if I can just sit down and I can just get it out, that's what I need. It isn't reading it again. That's why I don't hardly ever read it again. If I'm going to write a manuscript that I consider for publication or something like this, I write it with the intent. I actually started the first line saying that this is going to be a finished manuscript type of thing. I have to tell myself that. But it's that process of getting it out. And the healing part of this is, I can talk about that type of thing too. It's an incredible experience. And if people have ever not done it, they really should try all what you're talking about. It's fabulous.
Yeah.
At this.
Thanks, Judy. I can only imagine that if you actually did dip into those pieces, not looking for product, but just seeing who you were at those various moments.
Oh,
what
yeah.
What a journey, and what a window into your life.
Yeah, it is. Like I said, amazed to find out how much writing I just can't believe it.
All right, we've got one question here from Susan Patterson.
Not a question, just a statement. My husband's the 80-year-old. I'm only 9 months behind. However, I am just amazed at how much emotion you evoked from me in your reading of your poetry. And I think that fewer words, maybe, and just a thought or two here or there. And it just has inspired me to try to do some of that. Thank you very much.
Yeah. I hope you do.
All right, and then another question from Marianne. Marianne asks, besides Shel Silverstein and Mother Goose, how would you introduce children to poetry?
So that's a great question. First, I would say that, well, I have a couple of answers to that. The first is that the way I was introduced to poetry is that my dad sold encyclopedias door to door, and that earned him a set of childcraft that we had in our house. And so I would say the most important thing is to read poetry out loud to children. He and I can still, he's in his mid-80s, and I can start one of the poems and he can finish it. He can start one of the poems and I can finish it. So I have that richness that I would say poetry is meant to be heard and shared. So I would say any poetry you want to be, introducing to children to share it out loud. The National Council of Teachers of English and the International Reading Association, so the NCTE and the IRA, both give awards to poets for children and to poetry for children. And the lists of poets that they award and the lists of books that they award are worth taking a look at. I don't believe that there's a huge difference between poetry for adults and poetry for children, except in terms sometimes of content. But, poems that are good for children are often very engaging to adults. And the same can be true in reverse. So I don't think that there's a huge difference in how the poems are written. There are poets who cross over in many cases, but NCTE and IRA are two places that are good starts for finding poets and poems.
I can let people know I have a resource, Capillary District Library, the Mason branch has a poetry class the third Friday of every month, and we pick a book, or they pick a book, and they give you a wonderful packet, like it is on Zoom, so you don't have to go all the way to Mason. You go on the event calendar for Capillary District Library and you just sign up, and she will send you the Zoom link and she'll send you the handout. And there's a bunch of questions you answer, but then we dabble in writing our own poetry. And it's fun. It's not real serious where you're gonna get, if you really want to get serious, they do have a writing group too online. And you critique each other's writing on that one. So that's the real serious one. But they do have the poetry one Mason, and that's just a fun one.
So I'll say that for the folks online, the Capital Area District Library, and it's the Mason branch, has a Zoom group that meets the third Friday, did you say? And so if you go onto the Capital Area District Library website, you'll find it. And I think they're doing Amanda Gorman this month, aren't they? I think that's right. So there's
event calendar,
yeah.
Sign up anyway.
So you sign up on the event calendar, but that's a place to get more poetry.
Can I jump with a question, Laura? First of all, thank you. That was it was beautiful and incredibly moving. I have a question about poetry and healing. because my my approach and experience has been so different that we had a brief email exchange because somebody recommended a fine yellow dust to me, and I knew its content. And I lost a son, as I told you, in 2013. And to prepare myself for reading it, I poured myself a very large scotch and read for about 2 hours. And I think it's a real testament to the quality of the poetry. It wrecked me for 2 days. I found the beauty and brilliance in it, but very little catharsis. And I know I think the term these days is to lean into feelings and pain with an expectation of there being some relief as a result, which I've yet to experience. Is that, I mean, for people who don't experience that catharsis readily, what would your recommendation be? Push through it or accept that maybe we're fundamentally different?
Can I interject something? Maybe we need to differentiate between healing and catharsis. That's what I thought of listening to you, and I don't know whether that would come into.
When we were working with the Rwandans, this will sound like I'm not answering your question, but maybe I am sort of working toward it. When we were working in Rwanda, somebody said, one of the Rwandans said, what if this doesn't feel good? This feels terrible to write this. Why are we calling this writing and healing? Right? And Tanya Seagal, who was on the team, who was a brilliant psychiatrist in the Lansing area, said, and what's wrong with feeling terrible? And she didn't mean it in a heartless way. She meant it in, when they said this doesn't feel good, she was like, and maybe it doesn't feel good. And I don't know if that's the direction that I want. It just popped into my head that that I think is in line with what you're saying. That maybe sometimes being in touch with what feels so awful is with a big glass of scotch, not such a terrible thing. I don't know. How does that feel to you when I say that?
It resonates.
One of the things that was most frightening to me, and I think you might understand this, and anyone who has, had similar experiences of loss, part of, for me, the terror was that Hannah would disappear, that I wouldn't keep hurting. Like, whoa, I both wanted not to feel so awful, but actually I wanted to keep feeling awful. Because so it was that razor edge. And I don't know if that's what it was like for you, but that tilting seems to be some of what you're talking about. I don't know.
Yes, I'm not sure either. Yeah, whether there is
Were you sad that you had read it?
No. So which speaks to exactly what you were saying. I wouldn't unread it.
I wouldn't unread it.
I think there's also, to me, something rather healing and positive in seeing what people can produce in spite of pain. Yeah, it's a good illustration of our capacity to survive.
Yeah. Yeah, and when people ask me, because I do get notes from people saying, in fact, a classmate of Hannah's, a high school classmate of Hannah's, was lost to suicide, and her mother wrote to me and said, should I read your book? And I said, maybe not yet. Maybe not yet.
Speaking of your book, where are they for sale?
Well, they are for sure for sale online, but really they're for sale at Everybody Reads.
Laura, I'm wondering whether the power of healing from writing a poem is connected to your effort to make it public, to create something that you will be able to share, or whether there are also different poems that you write that you don't anticipate to become public, but that
So the question is if there are some poems that are public and some poems that are not public, that are just for me. Yes, I think an ongoing question for all writers is what to make public. And some of what's in a fine yellow dust, I really struggled with, whether it was private writing or public writing. And eventually I concluded that because Hannah had made parts of her life public through poetry, it was okay for me to do that. But that what I was navigating in a fine yellow dust was that I wanted to be telling my story of loss. And what I navigated in Rec Room Rwanda was my experience of Rwanda, and that anytime I felt myself slide into imagining that I had the right to create art out of someone else's story, that I was on a little bit more tentative ground. So for me, that's the boundary. And of course, there are poems that the world doesn't see. I think every writer has that, but partly the decision about that, is that did good work for me, and that's as far as it needs to go. Yeah.
Do we have any other questions? I see in the chat, one thing that Kent said is that Poem-A-Day, poets.org sends out a poem a day via email if you sign up. So that's good to know.
And actually, my email is my whole name, lauraapol@gmail.com. And there are about 5 or 6. So the slowdown was started by Ada Limon, and it just got handed off today to Major Jackson. But that has a poem a day. There are several places that have a poem a day, and I'm happy to send out to anyone who's interested a list. So thanks for that reminder that poets.org, poem a day, and then there are a number of other resources for poetry every day in your inbox online.
Yeah, go ahead, Susan.
I want to wish you well with your puppy. I know that the dogs can help healing, and maybe that'll be a poem coming up.
It's true, and actually she's getting very good at rolling over, thank goodness, because I don't know that I want to keep doing this.
Wonderful. Well, if no one else has any questions before we wrap things up, I would just like to thank you again for joining us today, Dr. Apol. We really appreciate you and everything that you shared with us today. It was really amazing. And I would just love to thank all of our attendees for joining this session as well. We always appreciate your support for this program. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much.
All right, with that, have a good night, everyone.
Thank you, Stella.